The young man was wandering the chaotic streets hidden behind the buildings of Venezia. His body was so thin he almost looked ill, but still his gaze was sharp and looked around with vigilance. It was Pannacotta Fugo, the mysterious young man who had exchanged some words with Coniglio, and afterwards was suddenly gone. He was walking towards a building, which sat at the back area of Piazza San Marco. There, among a group of old tea-color houses, was the den of the gang which ruled over Venezia. A room which had once been a cellar. The renovations were still perhaps ongoing. Scattered about the place were still several cement bags, big shovels, and pickaxes. He had been led into that room after having gone through a long and narrow corridor. I was now before a man of incredibly short stature.
For the first test, I can say you did well.
He must have been very old, because his voice was reduced to a whisper, and seemed to almost be about to be lost from one moment to the next. The room was very dark, illuminated only by the light of some candles. Old dust, probably accumulated throughout decades, let the outlines of the room fade in ambiguous darkness. Beyond such darkness, the man spoke again.
But it's not enough to make you accepted into the organization. You understand that, right?
The young man made an understanding gesture.
The final objective is a single one.
As much as he sought to train his eyes on it, the man's face remained shrouded in darkness and couldn't be seen. The candles, too, had been wisely placed so that he remained obscured. Fugo was stared fixedly at him, as if trying to read in the shadows the expression with which the man spoke to him.
The final objective is a single one. Buccellati's head. That's all the boss wants. You're well aware of that, aren't you? Fugo il Tratatore.
Pannacotta Fugo was one of the members of the group headed by Buccellati. He had been a child prodigy, son of wealthy people, with a surprising IQ of 152. To meet the expectations of those around him, he had worked so hard that he had entered university at the young age of 13. Fugo remembered very vaguely this period of his life, things like having played on his father's lap, or his mother who had kindly helped him in his studies. In the prosperous environment of a family of high society, he had probably simply let himself get carried away by his surroundings. To meet the expectations of those near, he had been a boy who had never had his own opinion. Of course, in almost every part of the world, most people experience a period of their lives spent in a similar situation. In that sense, his wasn't a particularly strange case. Be it the children of the rich, be it those of the poor, be it those who lost their mother or those raised in an orphanage, all struggle to find their own identity and often passively endure the matter of being children. His first act of rebellion happened right during university. Fugo, who had a tendency for being hot-tempered, had gone on a rampage over some trifle and savagely beaten a professor with a dictionary. The man was left gravely wounded and had been hospitalized with a prognosis of a few months. Obviously, Fugo was expelled. From that time onwards, he had completely lost his control. The parents did their best to convince him into resuming his studies, but at the smallest thing, Fugo would once again lose his temper. No one could keep him in check. The mother begged him, crying, to go back to what he used to be, and every time she did so, it deeply pained Fugo. No matter how much he tried, he couldn't control himself. Soon, he'd find himself without friends. Almost without noticing it, he had started frequenting domains of the underworld, until he wouldn't return home again. Despite joining an organization, his violent character remained unchanged. Even there, his companions started avoiding him. Soon all the gangs in Napoli knew that, when he got angry, he got to the point of nearly beating to death whomever he quarreled with. A terrible temperament, which seemed to want to act as counterpart to an unusual intelligence. In that dangerous balance, he lost himself, and the turmoil that ensued carried him to a new outburst of violence. Fugo, for the organization, was starting to become a nuisance. The one who had taken him under his wing at that point had been none other than Buccellati. Yet now, their paths diverged. The reasons had been manifold. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Golden Heart, Golden Ring, by Hirohiko Araki, Shotaro Miya, and Giichi Otsuka. Capitolo Duo. Venezia, famous city of the Italian Northeast. If you were to imagine Italia as a boot, you'd find it right over the calf, at the back of the knee. It is surrounded by an area of lands uncovered during low tide, called Laguna, and its exotic wonder derives from the maze of canals that traverse it, as well as from the many churches and large buildings that maintain the look and feel of when, in the 14th and 15th centuries, the Mediterranean commerce was at its peak. From northwest to southwest, crossing through the city center, runs the Canal Grande, a large canal in the shape of a reverse S. It is crossed by a large bridge of marble arches called Ponte di Rialto, around 28 meters in length. The Rialto area is among the most frequented of Venezia. On the bridge's vicinity are sold jewelry, lace, leather articles, and the famous Venetian glass, and it is here one can come across hundreds of tourists daily. Even on that day, there was huge bustle, between tourists voluntarily spending rivers of money and pickpockets who search for an easy way into their pockets. From the water stagnating all over the canals rose the saccharine odor of the sea, which mixed with the smell of beer and warm sausages, of hot dogs for the younger tourists, as well as a vegetable waste gone bad that occasionally peered out of some corner. All in all, nothing out of the ordinary. Except for one thing. Following for a while the main road crossing Rialto towards the south, after a bit to the left, a small square can be found in which stands a church. The destination is further beyond, after a long journey through the secondary roads. The small streets of Venezia are intricate like a maze, and you simply need to be one road away from the main street to see a completely different face of the city. Dusty, dirt-colored houses huddled together. On the ground, leftover vegetables and bones with some remaining meat still attached form piles of garbage here and there. An old skinny dog poked around at them with its nose. The impression given was that of a poor neighborhood, but this wasn't an isolated case. All that's needed is to walk away a bit from the tourists' cheerful voices and go in the side streets for places like this, like hideouts away from the eyes of the masses, to be found in abundance. In one of these lots of houses, there was one with a moss green door. Rather, it had been that color long ago. Almost all of the peeling paint had fallen, and its state was anything but good. On the front could be read the sign, Ristorante. It should have been a place where they serve you meals, but the impression given wasn't that. The glass in the windows was so old it had acquired an ochre color, and became irregular. Taking a look through these, strange guests could be seen in the interior, quite in accordance with a restaurant of this kind. In short, there were people. There were 3 suspicious-looking young men, and a boy with an old turtle on his right hand. They didn't look like locals, but they also didn't give off the impression of tourists who'd come to Venezia during vacation either. Perchance, one who knows certain environments would notice it immediately. Those were certainly criminals. A group that had its base in Napoli, and belonged to an organization called Passione. More accurately, that belonged to it until some days prior. The young man with black hair, Buccellati, only just 20, had been Polpo's right hand, one of the copy of the organization. When Polpo mysteriously died, leaving behind a personal fortune valued at around 6 billion, Buccellati had given it back to Passione, obtaining in exchange the position of capo. That is, he'd obtained Polpo's Neapolitan license to control gambling, betting, profits from extortion and smuggled goods, management of restaurants, hotels, and usurers. In short, he had gained control over an enormous circuit of money. As well as another thing. Polpo left behind an unfinished job, and that too was now in Buccellati's hands as part of his inheritance. It was an order Polpo had received from the boss of Passione shortly before dying. He had to bring Trish Una, the boss's daughter, to him in person, safe and sound. It was no easy task. When it comes to an enormous organization such as Passione, naturally traitors and enemies who try to get their hands in their trades aren't amiss. The boss's daughter, single blood link of his figure shrouded in mystery, was a real treat in the eyes of anyone who wanted to betray the organization, given that getting your hands on her could mean discovering the identity of the top leader. One couldn't ask for anything better. Buccellati and company ended up having to face a long series of traitor hitmen, with codenames such as White Album, Man in the Mirror, Talking Head, and many others. Only after shaking off their persistent attacks had they somehow succeeded at arriving in Venezia, like the boss had ordered them to. But what awaited them at their rendezvous, the island of San Giorgio Maggiore, was the discovery of reality they never had expected. The boss's real objective was to kill his own daughter. For fear of seeing his real identity found out, he had decided to eliminate anything that could provide a clue that would lead to him by his own hands, thus even including blood of his own. To protect himself, he didn't hesitate to kill an innocent girl, whose only mistake was being his direct descendant. Buccellati was unable to repress his rage at the boss's demeanor, and this had been the motive for his betrayal towards the organization. He had bravely confronted the boss, but his powerful stand, King Crimson, able to foresee the near future and erase some seconds of time, during which only he is able to move, completely defeated him. Thanks to his companion's intervention, Buccellati came out of this encounter alive, though barely. That had marked the beginning of the war. The problem was how to get out of Venezia and that island while avoiding ambushes from new hitmen surely sent after them. But, while deciding the course of action to be taken, time inexorably passed.
Abbacchio, do you know the Super Mario video game?
Over the table were lined up several empty wine bottles, leftovers of typical Venezian risotto alla pescatora, bigoli with anchovy sauce, alici marinate, salami, and other delicacies that made your mouth water from just looking at them.
It's had huge success all over the world. The main character of Super Mario was an Italian, who was called Mario.
The one talking was a young boy that gave a bit of a know-it-all vibe. His name was Narancia Ghirga. Big eyes and slightly upturned nose, lips always jutted out. He wore a short black jacket which left his chest out atop his trousers, also black. Black too were the pointed shoes decorated with a large metal stud, the most ornate item of his attire. The only splash of color on that black ensemble was a bright orange diamond-patterned piece of cloth he had wrapped around his middle. On his lap, he held a turtle with great care. From his constant moving, he let you catch a glimpse of something like childish. However, for Buccellati, this was a very important member of the group.
You know, he has a big mustache, and I think there's a striking resemblance.
What?
I'm talking about the Mario from the warehouse.
And?
Don't you get it? I'm talking about the warehouse we use in Napoli, the one down at the docks. He's a spitting image of old Mario Segali who guarded it.
Enthused over his own talk, Narancia fidgeted while speaking with the blonde-haired man at his side. Because he was waving about his fork, on which his pasta was rolled, sprinkles of anchovy sauce splashed here and there on the table. At such a sight, the other one grimaced.
Doesn't it resemble him? Eh? Tell me it doesn't resemble him.
He urged, leaning forward. With this movement, the wine glasses on the table wobbled dangerously. His three companions instinctively each took hold of their own for safety. "If you don't stop with that, you'll ruin your lunch," seemed to scold the glares shot together at the boy. At that, Narancia dropped himself back in the chair with a determined expression.
I swear they used Segali as a model for the character of Mario. Don't you believe it too, Abbacchio?
Shut it for a bit, Narancia.
The other retorted, punching him in the face.
Damn you! Do you know what you just did?
The man at whom Narancia was venting his rage was Leone Abbacchio, 20. Very long blonde hair, black coat, and trousers. His belt buckle was a big letter A, his surname's initial. He was the tallest of the group, at a height of 190 centimeters. His face held a stern expression similar to that of a Greek statue. The red lipstick he wore on his lips stood out, giving him a bizarre look, whereas he considered it extremely elegant. Although, no one would ever risk pointing it out to him. Before joining the gang, he had been a policeman, and there was no thug who wouldn't tremble even at a glance of his.
Ouch! It hurts!
Pressing with his hand on the back of his head where he had been struck, Narancia, fallen from his chair, struggled on the ground.
Ow, ow, ouch!
Are you alright, Narancia?
Came the concerned question from the boy sitting across the table. It was Giorno Giovanna. Short-tied blonde hair, a face with a proud look, resembling that of Michelangelo's David. His clothing, suit jacket and trousers, were of a rich green color, with large ladybug-shaped brooches on both sides of his chest. Not only that, but the belt had been a buckle also in the shape of a ladybug. It seemed Giorno really liked those beetles. Giorno was the newest addition to Buccellati's group. Perhaps it was because of that, unlike the others, in his behavior none of that harshness of a gangster could be found. Giorno oozed almost a sense of nobility, as if he were the prince of some country. Nevertheless, with his incredibly quick judgment in even the most extreme scenarios, he quickly gained the respect of the other members of the group.
Abbacchio hit me! Ouch. Ow. Fuck you, Abbacchio!
Stroking Narancia's sore head, Giorno replied.
Ah, yes. You have a nice bump.
Did you see Abbacchio hit me?
Narancia finally turned to the man that since the beginning, without ever even glancing at all that loud racket they'd been doing, had been engrossed in reading the newspaper. It was the man himself, the head of the group, Bruno Buccellati. What stood out the most about him was his hair, neatly cut into a straight bob cut. Stripped hair clips were attached right by his temples, so that at first glance, he almost seemed like a girl. Who could have ever said this was a capo of a criminal organization? His white suit, dotted with keyhole symbols, and traversed by large zippers on the arms and chest, made you think of an unordinary man. Since Buccellati kept reading unflinchingly, ignoring Narancia's desperate attempts at getting his attention, Giorno approached him and inquired.
Have you found any interesting articles?
Giorno, take a look at this.
Buccellati replied, pointing to an article on which, standing out in big letters, the title posed the question.
Attack with biological weapons.
It pertained to the incident that had happened the day before near the Basilica di San Marco, at the old and renovated Hotel Mondo Aria. It seemed that about 20 tourists and employees had been involved, but since an unidentified biological weapon had been used, the author hypothesized the use of a new type of virus. The victims were in such condition that not only could they not be identified, but also made it impossible to know how many there really were. A single person, a girl who worked at the hotel, had survived the attack, but was currently hospitalized in a severe state of shock. So far, no one had claimed credit for these actions, but the article stressed that they had been an atrocious crime, which, by targeting tourists, seriously harms Venezia's image, and that the brutality shown by the use of biological weapons made it a terrorist act which leaves you speechless, and concluded by heavily criticizing the actions of the assumed group which perpetrated it.
What strikes you about this article, Buccellati?
Asked Abbacchio, after giving a quick look at the newspaper Giorno handed over to him.
A new virus capable of quickly eliminating 20 people in an instant. Can you imagine what could do such destruction?
Buccellati asked him in response. It was Giorno who cut to the chase.
You suspect Fugo is behind this incident. Right, Buccellati.
What did you say?
Fugo had left their group a few days earlier. After the fight with King Crimson, Buccellati had expressed his decision to leave the organization and had said,
This will be a war with even less hopes of winning than the one we've been fighting up to today. Who will come with me?
Giorno, Abbacchio, Narancia. One after the other, his companions got into his boat. Only Fugo had adamantly remained on the island. He no longer felt like trusting this leader who proposed betraying and rebelling against Passione, the giant organization which up to that day had welcomed and protected him. Fugo's reasoning had been against wagering with such low chances of success.
I don't get why.
Narancia yelled. It had been Fugo who gave a helping hand to Narancia when, betrayed by his own parents, he'd lost all trust in other people. It was him who opened up the path for him to join the organization. And, despite being a year younger than him, he respected Fugo like a real older brother. Separating from him had already been too painful of an experience for Narancia. And now this. How could Fugo be guilty of a terrorist act that involved people who hadn't done anything wrong? Narancia couldn't believe it. Rather, he did not want to believe.
Maybe Buccellati's got a point. Fugo's Stan, Purple Haze, wouldn't have much trouble doing something like this.
Continued Abbacchio, after reading the article again.
But the range of his virus is about 5 meters around him. Instead, here all the people who were in the hotel lobby became casualties. It's a powerful virus, yeah, but these facts don't add up.
No. Shortly before the attack, there was a blackout at the hotel and the surrounding area. To be affected by Purple Haze's virus, one indeed needs to be as close as 5 meters. But that only goes for conditions with normal lighting. in the dark, and even more so in a closed space like the lobby of a hotel. It's not unthinkable for this contagion to strengthen up to 10, maybe even 20 times higher.
Indeed, that could be possible.
Abbacchio found no objection to Giorno's speculations. Purple Haze's virus was indeed dangerous, enough to swiftly kill anyone who breathed it in. On the other hand, it was very sensitive to light. Under sunlight, it lost effectiveness in a very short time, and with artificial light it lasted at most 30 seconds. However, in the special case where light was completely gone...
But then why? I see absolutely no reason for it.
Narancia retorted unfaltering, as he wouldn't allow himself to be convinced by Giorno's explanations.
It looks like someone sabotaged the nearest breaker panel,
commented Buccellati, who up to now had remained listening to Abbacchio and Giorno's discussion.
This would mean that Fugo wasn't alone. There are more people involved in this ordeal. At least one that cuts the power and one that spreads the virus into the hotel lobby. Essentially, the organization is involved.
At those words, a veil of heavy silence befell the table. In that dust-filled place, the mood had become very heavy. Due to shock, Narancia could no longer find his voice and stuck to brooding, tormenting the plate of pasta before him with his fork. Abbacchio too remained in silence, with eyes fixed upwards, on an imaginary point on the ceiling. Who knows what was going through Giorno's mind, when he picked up again the newspaper which was atop the table and immersed himself in his thoughts.
Fugo is back to receiving orders from the organization. I don't know his reasons, but can imagine that after leaving us, he returned to it.
This means the information I got a hold of has something to do with you.
The door opened, and making a bell chime with a sound so cheerful that it felt out of place, the man who had uttered those words came indoors. He was wearing a tight sweater with a diamond grid pattern and a pair of tiger-striped trousers. On his head, he wore a cap with a large arrow-shaped decoration on the front. It was an ensemble which would hardly have met the tastes of someone with common sense. But in hindsight, it turned out that no one in this group was wearing normal clothes. However, this newcomer with an athletic build surpassed all the others so far when it came to originality. His name was Guido Mista. He too was part of Buccellati's group. His torso was manly and athletic, the legs long and muscular, made for running. His body had been trained to the extreme, so much so that at first glance it made one think of the agility of a wild beast. More than anything, however, it was the gun he carried, holsterless, hanging from the trousers, which hinted at how dangerous he could be to deal with.
The thugs around here are real wimps. You just shake them a bit and they immediately piss themselves. Like this is not even fun.
And?
Abbacchio hurried him on, ignoring his banter.
My bad. It's true. You're right. Looks like those from Venzia are gathering a lot of explosives in the area. Amongst the gangs, there's even talk about the beginning of a war.
I think the explosives were for yesterday's affair at the hotel. Don't you agree, Buccellati?
Buccellati was of the same mind as Giorno. He nodded and replied,
I do think you're right, Giorno. And what's more, there's still a huge amount of explosives remaining, hidden somewhere waiting to be used. The organization really has intentions of continuing their work.
Do you have any idea where they could have hidden it, if the amount is that big?
Good question, Giorno. Apparently they aren't keeping it all in the same place, from what I've come to know.
And saying this, he pulled out a map of the city he had just bought, spread it on the table with a quick movement, and indicated several points in succession with his finger.
Here, here, and here. But I don't believe this is all of it.
We are few, and we certainly can't comb through the city house by house.
Besides that, Abbacchio, if we stand out too much, we risk being quickly found by the organization.
Giorno had a point. They shouldn't forget that the enemy would do everything they could to prevent their troublesome resistance. There was no time for this. Despite not knowing what were the organization's plans, it was clear that they were planning to do something there at Venezia with Fugo's stand ability. They needed to do something quickly. Abbacchio and Giorno remained staring thoughtfully at the map with folded arms. Buccellati turned to Mista.
You still haven't told us everything, right, Mista?
Of course, right. It's true. In reality, I've yet to say the most interesting thing.
Exclaimed Mista, surveying his companions gathered around the map. The most interesting thing that Mista hadn't yet told was that in the central area of the Venetian ghetto, near Ghetto Nuovo Square, there lived a certain old man. They left the restaurant only to arrive at Canal Grande, where they got onto a boat and thus traveled northeast towards Cana Reggio. Mista, who had memorized Venezia's map, drove the boat, turning left and right through the narrow canals. According to the information he'd obtained, the old man mentioned before, who went by Sepia, was the one in control of all the arms trafficking, such as rifles and ammunition, as well as explosives and other dangerous weapons which arrived in Venezia. He was a capable guy who in the organization held the position of capo. However, it seemed that the huge scale of the events that were taking place had frightened him, and there was talk of his desire to drop everything.
I heard those from the organization were complaining because they had to go find another solution. So there's no mistake. Being in trouble, they'll try to convince Sepia, and I'm sure they won't do it by asking nicely. They'll tie him up like a salami and lock him up somewhere. But if we manage to get our hands on the old man first...
The boat came out again into the main canal, crossed it, and entered another canal that was right in front of the church of San Marcuola. The ghetto wasn't far away.
Giorno, what's that dome thing?
Asked Narancia, pointing towards the building seen ahead of them to the left.
That's San Jeremia, and what resembles a dome is a Greek cross church. Somewhat exotic, don't you think?
Look at that. A place for prayer. I hoped it was for bowling.
For bowling?
Giorno couldn't help a smile full of irony.
You know, I'm not half bad at bowling myself.
Narancia continued, mimicking the throw of a bowling ball. At first glance, he came out as a rather carefree person, and that was a huge mistake many made. In reality, while making such inane talk, Narancia hadn't stopped looking around to check the situation, and his eyes shone with a glimmer that only one who won numerous battles could hold. The motorboat came to a slow stop. Mista stood up and said to his companions,
Here, this is it.
Old Sepia's dwelling was located some streets behind Ghetto Nuovo Square, on the ground floor of a decrepit building so run down it seemed the walls would collapse any time. At first it was hard to think of it as a residence of a capo from the organization, but from another perspective, it also meant its occupant was someone who had no doubts about its safety.
Well then, let's go!
Mista yelled, kicking down the fragile door. While the sound of broken wood was still being heard, Mista broke into the house, rolling forward on the floor. At that moment, Abbacchio and Buccellati, appearing simultaneously on the doorway, pointed their guns indoors. Between them, the smaller one, Narancia, slid forward, carefully observing their surroundings.
Ah!
Narancia let out a scream. A dark shadow had darted right in front of them.
The enemy?
What they found instead right in front of their guns was a black cat, looking just like he'd been interrupted in the middle of a nice nap.
You bastard! Scared the hell out of me.
Narancia cried, kicking the cat. The animal nimbly dodged the hit and jumped out of the open window, its presence gone quickly. It seemed to want to say it wanted nothing to do with any of this business. The place was empty. There was a small, carefully made bed, a table with a glass resting on top, and wine. Everything was neat and tidy, something somewhat strange for an organization's capo, but perhaps it was normal for an old person living alone.
Damn! They got here first.
Mista exclaimed, nervous. Giorno bid him to keep calm.
Let's try and see if we can find something.
It's pointless.
Abbacchio commented after taking a look at the nearest room.
The TV's on, and given that there's still a half-eaten meal on the table, can only mean that old man Sepia was taken away by force while eating, don't you think?
Then the organization has really been much quicker,
commented Buccellati, who had been listening to Abbacchio's words.
And now? What do we do now?
Shut your mouth, Narancia! We got Abbacchio's Moody Blues for this.
Exclaimed Mista. Then turning to Abbacchio.
Right?
Moody Blues. Abbacchio's stand wasn't a combat stand at all. When it came to destructive power and speed, it wasn't much different from an average man. Yet it had a truly unique power. It could replay the past events of a person. Moody Blues was capable of taking on the appearance of someone denoted by Abbacchio, and rewinding back the sequence of their actions just like a moviola. Afterwards, it would go through all the events that occurred to the person in their stead, showing them to Abbacchio and his companions. The timer on Moody Blues' forehead indicated the time separating it from the present, and if Abbacchio commanded so, it could seek a specific action by speeding up the replay, or show another in slow motion. Ultimately, Knowing the time and place where someone had been, this stand could go over anything they'd done. The plan was to succeed in following Old Man Sepia to wherever he had been taken.
I don't know the exact time in which I should look, but since he was eating, let's say around midday. Yeah, 3 hours ago. That should do it.
With that said, Abbacchio activated his stand, Moody Blues.
Old Sepia who was in his room 3 hours ago. Go, Moody Blues.
On that command, Moody Blues started twisting its body, which appeared as if made out of smooth purple vinyl plastic, and shaping it like a short old man. Not a particularly enjoyable sight. Narancia would never dare say it, but to himself he thought every time.
Blah, so disgusting.
And could never get used to it. In no time, before Buccellati and his companions, Moody Blues had turned into an old man with a hint of a mustache, who, rubbing his bald head, peacefully watched television.